This week on The Other Side, something different. We break from the news cycle for a special episode exploring the question, is Australia in crisis? We go off the set, literally, and have an armchair discussion with a couple of smart friends of the show about where our country is at. Something just doesn't feel quite right. How can we define it, and what should we be doing to fix it? G'day Brisbane, g'day Newcastle, and g'day Australia. Welcome to episode 308 of The Other Side Australia for the weekend commencing Friday, April 12, 2024. I'm Damian. This week we're stepping out of the news cycle for a second. We're taking a pause, a step back, to look at the big picture. We're going off the set, literally, for this very special episode as we explore the question, is Australia in crisis? Are you ready to get your thinking caps on? This is going to be quite a ride. Let's go. Some really scary stuff seems to be happening in our country and the wider Western world at the moment, and it's freaking people out. We seem to have lost any sense of what our core values truly are in the West. What is it that we stand for as so-called liberal democratic nations? The World War II generation is slowly leaving us. If you were born after 1933, you're now in your 90s. The elders are now the boomers, a generation who grew up in mainly boom economic times. They were in their teens and 20s during the sexual revolution and the hippie 60s, a time when the young questioned everything old, challenged all the established norms and authorities and traditions, and a lot did need to change. A bit of a shake-up was necessary. But 60 years on, and a hugely permissive and so-called progressive society, the question has got to be asked, did we throw the baby out with the bathwater a bit? As a Gen Xer who grew up in the affluent 80s, I was exposed to many left-wing philosophical ideas. A very, very simplistic worldview. Capitalism was bad, money was evil, the rich could be blamed for almost everything, and the most dangerous idea of all, the government was good and kind and would take care of everything if we just taxed the rich and redistributed the wealth. That left-wing view was kind of great. It saved me a lot of difficult thinking and hard work. It simplified the world for me into the bad rich people and the good poor people, the oppressed and the oppressors, as the socialists like to pretend. And it made my lack of personal success and struggle not only acceptable, but a badge of honor in a way. I had no idea that I'd actually been subjected to a lot of brainwashing at university. I accepted full responsibility for my decisions, but I had bought into the Marxist lefty narrative hook, line and sinker. All the artsy kids did. It was cool. It wasn't until much later in life when journalism and working in the corporate world forced me to face some facts. Other people had other ideas. Rich people weren't always mean and nasty. They were often nice and smart and very hardworking and conscientious. Corporations often did a lot of good. Capitalism was a really efficient way of getting things done in the most fair way possible. And not all left-wing people or poor people were nice and kind victims. Many brought many of their problems on themselves. And some of the biggest whingers and downers at work were the people who perpetually claimed some kind of victimhood or bad treatment. Now, I guess to most people this was just obvious growing up, but I was a slow learner. At the start of this century, I moved to Asia for work. I had a big corporate regional job and travelled all over the place. I realised that the countries that were functional and richer and worked the best had more free people and free markets and capitalism and were less corruptible. And the countries that were the most dysfunctional had less freedom, less free markets and more corruption. The main difference between the two was the size and degree of meddling of government. The more government involvement, the more waste, inefficiency, corruption and mess would result. The smaller the government and the bigger the private enterprise system was, the more wealth there was for everyone. Of course, nobody had a perfect system and the systems were mixed in many places. But generally, the smaller and less intrusive the government was, the better the outcomes. Then I came home after almost 20 years away. And just as Australia was entering the COVID crisis, And I saw a country with a lot of freedom willingly giving it up to big government interventions and intrusions without batting an eyelid, with almost no complaint. And when some people did complain, they were shut down, mostly by other Aussies, in the form of mass social ridicule and mockery and direct dobbing, and ultimately in the form of some of the worst police overreach ever seen in Australia's history.
Down the ground! On the ground! Anything. Oh!
The police line surrounding the shrine grew gradually tighter, with occasional forays into the crowd to pick out protesters for arrest. Many of the marchers are union members, angry at having to choose between a jab and their job. Others are venting frustration after more than 230 days of lockdown in Victoria, and with weeks more to come. Victoria is something of a paradox. It's one of the most progressive states in the country and has been ruled by Labor governments for 18 of the past 22 years.
That's ABC News. They think it's a paradox that a Labor government would become authoritarian and use brutal police force. Did they miss the 20th century or something? This was not the Australia that I left in 2001. Something big had changed. The kids weren't fighting the establishment anymore. They were the establishment. They didn't hate authority and government and resist it. Now it was cool to embrace government and do its bidding, mocking any fellow citizens who even dared to question the scientific modelling and super simplistic blanket shut everything down approach of our very silly state governments and administrators. So all that nice and kind sounding harmless stuff that I've been taught at uni in the 80s by hippie lecturers from the 60s about the left wasn't harmless after all. I began researching where it all came from and found that nothing was accidental. There was an academic school of thought in Europe in the early 1920s where all this began. This group, known as the Frankfurt School, was a bunch of social scientists and researchers who were focused on the application of Marxism to philosophy and society. They started in the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Their work led to the development of a thing called critical theory, which is a Marxist worldview that wrongly sees everything through the lens of oppression and oppressors. And it's had a massive influence on the social sciences right up until today. Because of World War II, the Frankfurt School academics spread all over the world, and so did their dangerous ideas, right through America and Europe and the West, particularly in the 1960s and again in the early 2000s. Now, it's the thinking behind the idea that government has some role to play in making life equal. The problem is that as soon as you appoint a small group of elites in government to make everything equal, they become the new elites and start to do awful things. We saw this right through the 20th century, during which tens of millions of people were murdered by their own governments in the name of neo-Marxism and ideas that can be traced back to Marx or to critical theory. How many people were killed by their own communist governments in the 20th century, Dennis Prager?
Vietnam, 1 million. Eastern Europe, 1 million. Ethiopia, 1.5 million. North Korea, 2 million. Cambodia, 2 million. The Soviet Union, 20 million. China, 65 million. And the numbers are conservative. And of course, these numbers do not describe the suffering endured by hundreds of millions of people who were not murdered.
Thank you, PragerU. So, none of what I thought was just my nicer, kinder, smarter, fairer view of the world happened by accident. It was taught to me. And actually, there was nothing nice, kind, or fair about it. And it's definitely not smarter. Leftism is actually the ideology of the dumb and the naive. And now it's surging again. But this time it seems the culture is noticing it and calling it out. It's been branded, which is a good start. We now call it woke culture. We know that it's fundamentally wrong. It goes against thousands of years of thinking and philosophy and evolution. And it goes against human nature and common sense, and people can feel it even if they don't fully understand its roots intellectually. I'm optimistic. I think it will die out. The problem is, how much damage is it going to do before it does? Many bad actors are happy to use woke culture to achieve their political and personal power objectives and business success. But we believe the main power it has comes from ignorance. Ignorance about where all our traditional Western civilization's rules and ways of operating came from, especially ideas about money and economics. And that is why I started The Other Side. Australia's billion-dollar-plus taxpayer-funded national broadcaster is steeped in critical theory ideology. Almost every news story on the ABC implies in its subtext that, quote, the government should do something to fix it, unquote, whatever the it happens to be in any particular news story. The government should do something to fix it. It sounds nice. The idea that if government would just take more money from the economy and stick it into problems, then the problems would go away. But they almost never do. Funnily enough, when you stick money into something, it gets bigger. In recent weeks, we've seen some massive voting numbers for the Greens in elections around the country.
Today, we bring the people's protest into Parliament. Free Palestine!
Thank you, Senator Faruqi.
Ah yes, the Greens. They are a socialist party and the main supporters of woke ideology in Australia. They average 10 to 20% in elections. But among young people and in the inner cities where a lot of the managerial, government and educated class live, their primary vote has been as high as 45% recently. This is serious. Much more serious than a lot of people realise. 45% isn't to be sneezed at. It means that 1 in 2 people almost walked into the polling booth and put a 1 next to the Green candidate's name. And this happened in a Brisbane City Council election, where the Green candidate had openly said that he supported shoplifting and squatting in empty homes.
If people are poor, they can't afford the rent, they're living below the poverty line, I think it is ethically justifiable.
That's anarchy, mate.
No, it is ethically justifiable.
That's anarchy. No wonder you're an anarchist.
Let me finish. I think it is ethically justifiable if people who cannot afford to put food on the table, whose kids are going
Break the law.
hungry, shoplift.
That was their Lord Mayoral candidate for the Brisbane City Council election, Jonathan Sriranganathan, on Brisbane's Radio 4BC in October. So there they were, clearly articulated neo-Marxist ideas, and that still didn't put voters off. So you can't dismiss this as a one-off fluke. It's a trend. And it's not all, but a significant proportion of young people, Gen Y millennials mainly, many approaching their early 40s now, who do not seem to be growing out of lefty thinking like Gen X and most hippie boomers did as they grew up. We think this is because of the fact that with the retirement and passing of the World War II generation, the left-wing boomers of the 60s have now been in control of academia, schools, media, and a lot of the government for more than 20 years. What's scariest and most worrying of all is that their ideas are now infiltrating the world of capital, the business world, and making capital less free. Money used to be the way people could rebel. Quit work, go start a small business, prove your own ideas, push back against the man. But now big corporations, through the HR and PR and marketing and compliance legal departments and outside consultants desperate for a buck, have all embraced this woke ideology through ESG measurement. That's environment, social and governance. The social is the dangerous one. And DEI measurement. That's diversity, equity and inclusion. Ideas that are unashamedly rooted firmly in neo-Marxist critical theory. They're quite open about it and they're proud of it.
DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. That sounds nice and responsible. No wonder all big companies now require employees to get training in it.
Because we understand that racial and systemic bias have many causes, sources, and ways of showing up within each of us.
There's a whole industry now designed to cater to companies looking for a quick way to check that box. In the U.S. in 2020, DEI was a $3.4 billion industry.
All white people are racist.
Some trainings are just divisive and dumb.
I believe that white people are born into not being human.
This is extreme, I take it.
It is extreme, but it's becoming more of the norm.
These slides were shown at a Coca-Cola diversity training.
The thesis of this training was try to be less white. They're talking about arrogance and things like that. That is by no means a white thing. The point is to demonize the other side as much as possible.
That report from Stossel TV. So now big corporations are working with big government to squeeze out anyone who doesn't play the big game. If you don't sign up to DEI and ESG as a big company, you don't get any capital investment anymore. Good luck getting a loan from a big bank or being invested in by the big asset management firms, the big superannuation funds in Australia. They're even largely controlled by industry groups that are connected to unions. They aren't going to give you any of the money taken from taxpayers against their will as compulsory super contributions. So the big corporations must comply, which means they won't hire people who don't also comply. And woke, therefore, wins. Who suffers? The rebels, mainly small business people, entrepreneurs, the innovators, the very people that a capitalist society needs to survive and thrive. So this is why I say we are in crisis and we need to chat. Our culture is socialist and it's getting more so every election as the Greens vote creeps ever higher. We have no strong right-wing free market party. Labor has shifted even further left and bought into woke, and the Liberal Party is falling over itself to become more left-wing. They keep losing elections and the dopes within the party keep saying, we aren't left-wing enough, that's why we're losing. Now they're kicking people out or keeping people out of the party who challenge that view. So the Liberal Party is now a centre-left political party and a complete lost cause. They haven't noticed the trends elsewhere in the world, even as close as New Zealand, where people are rewarding traditional conservative centre-right parties that fight back and go more right, not left, in response to this wave of leftist culture. So we really are in big trouble. The left have captured big business. They've captured the main right-wing political party. The big question is Australia in crisis, and how do we get out of it? And that is the focus of our discussion this week. It's time to go off the set. Joining me today for our deep dive are two men who I think are two of the smartest thinkers that we've had on the show in the past. Both of them were guests separately on the Other Side Interviews show that we did for a few weeks last year, where we just have someone on for a long podcast style interview. Both of them are not all that well known, but both those shows got big viewership because these guys and their ideas are pretty interesting. Scott Pelto is a businessman and commercial head of one of Brisbane's leading local law firms. Scott has an interesting background and a mix of experience. He finished high school in the 1980s and he went into the police force for 11 years, where he spent 5 years as a criminal law prosecutor. While in the police service, he completed a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Commerce degree that took him into accounting. He became an auditor and worked for one of the big four firms, Deloitte, bringing his policing and accounting experience together in forensic accounting and heading up the Brisbane office of Deloitte Forensic. Rob McMullan is a local small businessman, occasional politician and passionate thinker who studies the concept of natural law, a theory that might help us understand the political, economic, social and philosophical wackiness of our times. Natural law is a theory in philosophy that says that all humans are born with an inherent universal set of moral rules that govern human conduct. These laws aren't imposed by governments or imposed by courts, but they're our inherent sense of right versus wrong or justice. We had a fascinating discussion on the show last year all about that. Welcome back, Rob. Welcome back, Scott. It's great to have you both here.
Damian. Hey, mate.
So, guys, the point of the show is that leftism is everywhere at the moment. It's infiltrated, as we said in the opener, our schools, it's infiltrated media. They've got control of the media. They're in our political system because we don't really have a strong right-wing conservative or even centre-right party anymore. They're now in capital, which is amazing, right? They've infiltrated corporations and business and through ESG and DEI. So there seems to be a fundamental problem that most Aussies, especially the young, seem to have no understanding of what our system is and how it works, right? The idea that the liberal free market is not something that just fell out of the sky, that it evolved, that it's got a system attached to it, that capitalism has a system to it and it actually works and alleviates poverty. We're not teaching that stuff at schools and kids aren't hearing it. So, Scott, where does that all stem from, that ignorance that kids seem to have these days of capitalism, of liberal economics?
Well, Damian, I imagine that it has come from people like us not teaching kids about responsibility. It's one of the foundations, obviously, of reciprocal cooperation between individuals. And if they don't understand that responsibility, has an element of effort and suffering, and we have to embrace that to effectively, find fulfillment. Now, these kind of words are not the kind of words that younger people want to hear. They would much prefer to hear ideological slogans that suggest things come a lot easier, and that's the direction that they want to head in.
And that's what the Greens do. Obviously, it's just a message that you can have everything you want, and if you don't have anything or you're miserable, it's somebody else's fault. It's the boomers, or it's the nasty capitalists, or it's whoever the oppressor might be in that narrative. But you're basically saying we can't absolve ourselves of responsibility. Well, we've somehow failed as Gen X or boomers to educate, to mentor, to be there. I mean, that would be consistent with your natural law theory, I guess.
Yeah, well, look, I'd like to first off say that the Greens are always targeting young people because children are not responsible. They're not as responsible as adults, so that's our starting state. But what we actually have to do is grow into being trained into responsibility. So there's a process there, but for their own political goals, it's in their interest to interrupt that process and keep people in a dependent state, because that suits, like I said, their political goals. But we talked a lot about entropy, and I find it a fascinating concept because it is a force of nature that any structure without a continual input of energy is going to entropy. Things are going to fall apart. If I don't eat, I will fall apart. If you don't restore a home, it'll fall apart. If you don't repaint a house, it'll fall apart.
We live in a universe of entropy.
Well,
right?
It's a constant force of nature. Through time, things are breaking down through time. And what you really find when you talk to a lot of left-wing activists about their worldview is they don't have an understanding of this fact. They say things like, well, if we just redistributed all the money, everyone would have enough. But that's not a through time understanding
of reality.
No, that's like taking a screenshot of a movie and thinking that's all there is, just the screenshot, just frozen in time. But money is something that happens through time. Entropy is a constant force which we're always trying to outrun. And it is part of the natural world, and that ties in with our natural law thing. So to mirror
philosophers and religious people would say we live in a broken world, a fallen world, right? The concept of the fallen world, which is a lot of religions.
Yeah.
That would be, you've got to work to even maintain the status quo, because the tendency is to entropy.
That's right.
So the idea of responsibility.
And I think taking up on Rob's point that one of the things they talk about is if we redistributed all the money, then everything would go okay. That to me shows a fundamental lack of understanding of what money is.
Yeah.
Because if I take a couple of minutes to explain that quickly, money is a medium of exchange and nothing more. It has fundamental elements. One element is that it's a store of value, where you can store value over time. It transgresses over time.
Yeah, so
and another fundamental element is it's got to be infinitely divisible, so that we can buy anything from, a cup of coffee to an island in the Caribbean, that kind of thing.
Yep.
So if you focus on the purpose and the function of money, which is to capture the value of an item, a product
in a particular time and geography, and transport it to another time and geography,
and then take that representation of that value in the money and move it forward.
Yep.
You'll understand that the primary focus is on the product. It's not the money. So really you need to, if you're going to talk in that way, you would have to say, well, let's take all of the product and distribute that, across everybody. But as we know, that's, the product once distributed is gone.
Right.
So there's a never-ending cycle.
And what they don't realise, is that once you do that, once you take that product off someone who's produced it and you redistribute it to someone who hasn't produced it, you've just incentivized the behaviour of the person who isn't producing by rewarding them for not producing, and you've penalised the behaviour of the person who produced by taking half of their earnings off them.
You've increased the entropy in the system.
You've increased the entropy in the system, yeah.
Well,
yeah. So
maybe the other important thing to get across, and this will come down to government's role in the process, is the monetary system that we've now operated under for a little over 100 years is what they call a fiat monetary system. So fiat means by decree, decreed by an authority, in this case government. So we know that the paper notes or the plastic notes have no intrinsic value whatsoever. The only reason they have value is because there is a decree that they will represent, value.
Well, once upon a time it was backed by gold. We came off the gold standard in the 60s, the 70s. We've had this floating currency situation. Without getting into the theory of money too much, we'll be there all day. But basically, the idea that you can just print more money, which is the basis of Keynesian economics, or modern monetary theory is the extreme version of that, that the Greens actively promote, right? The Socialists actively promote, government can just keep... Well, the reason they promote that is it is a form of redistribution, right? It's a form of devaluing the money of those who've got that money and have saved it and giving it to others.
Well, to get to the end point really quickly, because as you say, it's a long conversation, but the bottom line of it all is when we went off the gold standard and fiat money ruled the economies of all Western democracies, that means that the governments control the monetary system. So when the governments control the monetary system, they have at their disposal the power to, in essence, appropriate the entire wealth of countries. The entire wealth.
Okay, let's just repeat that point. They have within their power
That's right.
the ability to appropriate all the money, all of the wealth, all the actual wealth.
They control the system.
Yeah.
So, as they print it, and it's not just printing money, it's credit terms as well, because providing credit is the same as creating money. If there's not something there to back it and you create the credit, that's the same as creating more money. And everybody knows that more money means more inflation, and that of course is the cost.
Well, does everybody know that? Does the average kid?
I'm skeptical.
If you walked out, if you walked down the street, you said to a kid, hey, why doesn't the government just print more money? And you have to explain to them, well, if there's $100 in the system, and your apple, costs you, is worth $5 today, and then you print another $100. Then there's $200 in the system. Guess what happens to the price of your apple? It goes up to $10.
So you can increase the money supply if there's also a corresponding increase in goods and services, i.e. reciprocal value to people. But if you don't actually have an increase in production, you have an increase in the money supply, you'll get inflation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, at the core of it, there's an understanding. This is what we're talking about today. Really, is that. Limits, should there be limits imposed on the powers that governments have? And when you come down to the core system, which is the money supply, subject to them allowing inflation to run away, they can in essence print or issue credit, any amount of money, which effectively appropriates the entire wealth of the nation. They have the system. Under the gold standard, another element of our money is that it's got to be in scarce supply. It can't be an unlimited supply, because if it is an unlimited supply, then
it's worthless.
Correct.
Yeah. So scarcity has to be enforced somehow, and we enforce it with the government controls. But if the government wants to, it can print more money, and therefore it takes. But where the left get confused is they think, the government's printing more money, they're creating more value in the system. No, they're not. You can't create more value in the system unless you have productive work.
All the value.
Someone has to do stuff.
All the value is in what we produce.
Yes.
All of it.
Yes. So that's the problem. So we get to redistribution, and we're talking about taking value from person A or group A that's productive and giving it to group B that's not productive. Now, social security, baseline, sort of, looking after people, making sure that they can eat and have a bit of a shelter is something you want to have in a civilized society, and that's why we have a degree of social security. But you know, it's easy for the left to say, well, you know, isn't everybody entitled to an education? Isn't everybody entitled to free healthcare? And it sounds like, well, yeah, you know, everyone should get a free education. Everyone should get free healthcare. Everyone should get but how do we deal with that? I mean, where do you draw the line and say, well, we just can't afford it, or
I think it's all about understanding. So, you know, and I can see why people get maybe misguided or misled, you know, by money. You've really got to understand that it's nothing more than a medium of exchange for what lies underneath it. So you talk about a free health system. Well, I would say to you, Damian, do the nurses and doctors work for free?
No, I mean, sorry, I don't mean that there is a free health system. I mean, there's value and effort put in that, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I get your point. So the question I'm asking is, you know, where do you draw the line? And the socialists would say, well, you draw the line pretty far up the chain. So it's like, you know, the NHS in the UK, or you have completely free health care. You have completely free education system. But you're going to go broke if you keep doing that, right?
This is where I would say you draw the line. It's important to understand that we have to have a system of government. We have to have the rule of law. Without those things, we can't cooperate reciprocally in society and exchange goods. Okay. They're part of the mechanism. But if that goes too far, you know, then in essence, and particularly with the monetary system that we have, because money is a store of value going into the future. So when you save those dollars in your pocket, that's effort that you put into today
that you want to reap in the future.
Exactly, to save for tomorrow. So
if the government prints more money, they're stealing that from me.
And you know, that's
my kids.
You know, at a higher level, metaphorically, maybe you could say that that's your destiny. You know, it's your effort that you went to today, for sacrifice today for something for tomorrow. Yeah. So, you know, where do you draw the line? Given that when the government appropriates money, prints it or taxes it or takes it in any indirect manner, you know, it's not taken in a voluntary way. So, you know, Rob will talk about the elements.
By force.
Well,
all right, so let's go to that.
It's involuntary.
Yeah,
you know, so.
Yeah. So involuntary means we're coming to get it whether you like it or not. And if you don't pay your taxes, we're putting you in jail. So what does that do to the motivation of the person who earned the money, who made the money, and how does that tie in with natural law?
Well, like we said before in our first chat, incentives are what exist. You know, if you disincentivize people to produce, then they don't. And to tie into what Scott's saying, I think what you mean by destiny is, you know, usually the right is capitalizing. We look at increasing wealth through time. One of the main drives of the left is consumption. They want to consume. And so you've got consumption versus capitalizing. You're talking about capitalizing. You're obviously a capitalizing person.
Yes.
And the left are hyper-consumptive. So they think they can consume from the system, and I don't think they have an awareness that you can actually consume the systems that create the wealth in the first place. I don't think that's part of their worldview.
Well, I think that's where we're at in Australia. I don't think kids understand that.
They don't understand.
Money doesn't grow on trees, that the government can't just print it and hand it out, and it's going to have the same value as it had yesterday.
They don't understand. Yeah. And, you know, well,
it's like the shoplifting thing. Sorry to interrupt, but that Jonathan Sree, you know, saying, oh, we should shoplift. It's like, mate, you're stealing from, it's okay because it's Coles and Woolies and they're big. You're stealing from the shareholders of Coles and Woolies, firstly. You're stealing from the staff of Coles and Woolies.
You're making the price of food at Coles and Woolies increase.
So you're stealing from the other customers, right? I've got to pay for that shoplifting later. It's like there's no concept of this value. Kids don't have this idea in their mind that there's any repercussion of this or any... So, you know...
Well, that's what I talked about, interrupting that process of adulting.
Right.
That interrupting that process of growing people into adult responsibility. And that's where we're at. You know, one of the gripes I have with a lot of conservative commentators is to say, well, they'll learn when it hits the back pocket, when the consequences hit. That assumes a lot. I think that assumes that people actually are responsible adults mentally, and that they will understand the causality. I'm very skeptical of that. I don't think they will.
Rob.
It's not happening.
No, it's not happening with Gen Y. They've found that as they're getting into the 40s, which they are now, the older ones are like 43 of the millennial generation, that they're not shifting their politics as we did in Gen X and the boomers. you know, to the right. As you grow up, you become more aware of these things and you change your thinking.
Well, we're worried about the increase in Green votes in Brisbane, and I think it's indicative of an interruption into what we call adult responsibility, looking at the system as a whole, understanding the incentives that drive the whole system. They're really just more like thinking in the now, localized, hyper-consumptive. I can take that for me, and they take for granted the system. But I think with the cost of living, obviously so many economic hardships imposed by the government's response to COVID, people are doing it tough, and I don't think they are understanding the causality there. I don't think they're understanding the causality between the entropy in the system, the lack of money, how hard it is for everybody, and they're funneling people into the Greens. And so to wrap up my entire point very specifically, I think largely the left is going to left. I don't think they're ever going to get it.
Right.
I think there needs to be a counterbalancing force from people who are responsible, from conservatives, adult conservatives who go, you know what, I'm voting and I'm looking at the system beyond what suits me right now. I'm looking at the whole system through time. And as Scott said, largely conservatives have abdicated responsibility. I would say, you know, like any system will entropy if you stop inputting energy into it. The people who are responsible have stopped putting energy into teaching young people. I think that's largely what's happening. So to give you a concrete example, if you'd like, an example of energy is having a uncomfortable conversation with people. You know that takes energy to tell people something they don't want to hear. But I mean, I do that out of a sense of responsibility sometimes. You know, imagine we're talking about money as exchange of value. Imagine saying to a young left-wing person, if you've got no money, it's because you don't provide anything of value. I've done that a few times and they freak out. They freak out. They freak out.
But it's
the stark truth. I mean, there's a lot of people that you will encourage and nudge in certain ways. You know, usually what I'm saying is be lovingly blunt, and you might follow that up with, but I'd love to help you develop into somebody that does create value.
Right.
Well, that's the responsible thing to do, is to offer a solution.
That's right. That's right.
In that circumstance.
That's right. And I think that's largely what's got to happen. You talk about capital going woke and things, is that people who have capital and responsibility, and you know, look, there's a lot of, I don't want to go down the path of like a generation war, but it is the stark reality these days that the older generations have the lion's share of the time, lion's share of life experience, lion's share of wealth, and the lion's share of political agency. And so if they...
So you're talking boomers and older Gen X?
Look, from the numbers I've seen, it's like 55 and up. Compared to 55 and down, they have a lot more political agency, time, life experience, and monetary wealth. And so I think I would encourage anyone listening to that to think about, if the system's going to persist, if the people who have the capacity to input energy into it don't.
Yeah.
If the people who have an asymmetry of capacity for responsibility don't take responsibility. And a lot of that is mentoring young people. Look, I will say, I was a young lefty. I came out of university degree. To be honest, because of my miseducation, it probably took me to my mid-20s to actually stop believing it was immoral to make money.
Yeah, right.
And do you know what a behind the eight ball? It is and
you're the only millennial in this room.
Well, I'm being completely honest. Yeah. It was my mid-20s when I heard older men say to me, you know, it's, if you're providing a good reciprocal service, you're providing value to another person, it's not immoral to ask for a price.
No.
It's not, but that's what I believed.
Right. That's how.
And the way I came out of that is I worked in a small business with a boss who would tell me about how to run a business on a lunch break.
Yep.
I worked with people in my industry, and I found a lot of people on the internet talking about politics and philosophy and natural law and things like that. So I was able to get myself out of it. But I could only do that because I was shown a pathway. And what worries me now is what we're seeing with this Greens vote is like people are going to strive one way or another. But the Greens, you know, set up all these preconditions and then offer a solution which is their political goal in the first place. And we're losing people to that ideology because people, you know, they're facing very real hardships with housing and cost of living. And if you don't want people to go down that pathway, you've got to guide them this way.
Absolutely, yeah.
In essence, you've got to do that in a selfless way.
That's right.
Talking about the people that are 55 and over, they're quite comfortable. They can make it easily for the remaining days of their life.
That's right.
But they have a responsibility in a selfless way to assist.
So we're not doing enough.
We're not assisting.
We've also let kids down, I think, at the boomer level. You know, we've let kids down. We haven't perhaps educated them quite the way we should have. We're not mentoring. Let's talk about men. Like, I mean, what's happened to the role of men in society? There's a traditional male mentoring, no disrespect to women because they have a role to play here too, but men, the role of the man in Australian society at least has become quite degraded, quite looked down upon, quite frowned upon.
Well, you know, it's always an uncomfortable conversation, but as you say, we've got to address it. Fundamentally, I think we all acknowledge that men and women are different. It's the way we're born. We have, you know, women who obviously are the people that give birth to every single person on the planet. They fundamentally have, you know, they're fundamentally more nurturing and more caring than men, you know, for example, who come at it from a different perspective. Now, that in no way means that women can't do anything they want. You know, I've got two.
Well, that men are worse than women anyway.
I've got
it's equal, but not equal, but not the same.
I've got two daughters who I will tell every day of the week they can do anything they want and become anything they want. That doesn't mean there are not natural tendencies toward things.
Oh, that's right.
And people will find fulfillment, you know, following what they naturally, you know, tend to do.
But Rob, you spoke about men mentoring men and fathering, and we've seen that in the United States. The problem with the absent father, the impact that has on society. The role of the father is not something that we put on a pedestal in Australia. It's something that we mock in advertising. It's the doofus dad, icon that we sort of everybody stereotype that everyone jokes about.
I'm going to go there.
Go there, brother.
I'm going to go there.
Go there, brother. It's the brotherhood.
You look at a lot of the social science. There's a lot of it out there. There's a general, it's not always a one-to-one, but there's a general trend that left is a political manifestation of the feminine and the right is a political manifestation of the masculine. And we talk about feminine consumption, masculine capitalizing. And that's why you have a show talking about the GDP and economics. It's going to be a lot of older blokes. And then you look at any Labor policy pandering to women, they know that the left is largely...
has the caring bias.
It's the empathetic bias, empathetic feminine bias. You know, in their psychological science, you've got feminine empathetic cognitive bias, versus, which means that they're very tuned. It doesn't mean you can't think of other things, but it's just like a first point. The easiest path for the water to flow in the brain is empathy. It's the first place they
And it doesn't mean that it's a male-female divide either, but there will be a tendency.
It's a 70-30.
70-30 sort of, yeah.
Some, and even Jordan Peterson say some men have more feminine temperament, some women, but it's still a 70-30. So the point is it's politically...
You're saying there's more than two genders, are you, Rob? You can't say that.
No, I'm saying personalities. Personalities diverge, yeah. But it's still a politically, in a democracy system where you need 51% of the votes, it's still a politically relevant template. And you know what? I've known about this for a long time, but I looked at the data coming out of the 2022 election, and even Labor think tanks are explicitly saying all around the world, left is women, right is men, young men. It's like you're getting a gender split there.
You know, I also wonder, you know, talking about this, because I've noticed that as people get older, you're one, I was probably one as well. We started with left tendencies, and as we got older, at, you know, accepting and adopting more responsibility, we moved right. Now, if you think about the family structure, which is fundamental, you know, it's the one of the oldest institutions, and everybody accepts the value, or you know, the vast majority of people accept the value of the family unit. when you have a family unit and you have kids, like you said before, kids aren't responsible, you know, at a very young age. Parents have to take responsibility for the children. But the role of a parent, the fundamental role of a parent, I would say, is to raise your children to be independent so that they can compete well in a competitive world. And so there's a shift, there's a trend from not being responsible to being independently responsible. And the governance over that, the parents and the family, they would act more like a socialist arrangement, you know, where they take the authoritarian control and take the responsibility and impose, you know, certain things. They don't give absolute freedom to the children because that would be dangerous. I mean,
there's an element of left-wing feminine infantilization, which Jordan Peterson would call the devouring mother.
Okay.
The mother that doesn't want the children to fly the nest, to leave the nest.
Correct.
And as you were saying, what's the point with the gender stuff and our society now? I think that our move leftward is hand in hand with the fact that you could turn on a 90s sitcom and the dad doesn't have respect. I think largely to consume more productivity, it's undermining masculine virtues and masculinity in order to consume more, because it will be more. And it's not all men or all women, but it will be more of an archetypical masculine that looks forward into the future and sees more systems and looks at the GDP and the economy through time.
And says we can't afford that, kids.
That's right.
Go and ask your mother. Mum wants to give wants to nurture, which is essential, and then it's dad that steps in and says you can't have that, right?
That's right, because there's limits.
This is not a gender thing, right? Totally, okay? It's partially a bias.
But you argue with a left-wing person and they say you lack empathy, and vulnerable groups. This is the terminology they use, empathy. Well, I'm saying scientifically, the psychological science, they have an empathetic cognitive bias, but also vulnerable groups. So we're talking about vulnerable groups, and is it this feminine nurturing? We need to nurture the vulnerable groups, whereas it's more. Sometimes, in some arenas, the dad's ability to say, you know what, through time we've got to make sure we don't go broke, and there needs to be limits. And unfortunately, you know, sometimes men have to act as a proxy for nature because scarcity is part of nature. Entropy is a part of nature, it's all the natural law stuff. But I think the demonization of masculine virtues throughout our culture has gone hand in hand with this political shift.
Demonization, we define masculinity. The feminist movement defines masculinity as toxic now.
Well,
and so it's like masculinity itself. We talked about toxic elements of masculinity once, or toxic masculinity. Now masculinity, period, is toxic. So traditional masculinity, traditional, you know, I mean, any kind of aggression or not all violence is negative. Some violence is to protect.
My view is it's important that none of us demonize anything. You know, half of the people on the planet are male and half of the people on the planet are female. Yep. You know, we must cooperate together and play to our strengths.
Absolutely.
Which is what I said. Men and women are different. That doesn't mean that women can't do anything and men can't do anything. But you know, if you've got a strength, whatever that is, you would play to it.
But nature has provided this balance between the masculine and the feminine. You see this in philosophy.
Division of labour. A division of labour. We're different but compatible.
Yep.
And when you try to make people the same, you undermine that division of labour. You're actually undermining our value to provide value to each other. So our ability to provide value to each other, because you're undermining the division of labour.
Well, being different and compatible is very productive.
That's right. So that's once again coming into the entropy in the system. We've allowed the division of labour between I'm going to say not men and women, the masculine and the feminine, whichever way you personally are more inclined as a personality. But the division of labour between the masculine and feminine, we've undermined that productivity, and once again we're feeling the entropy in the system.
Wow.
And so to input energy to maintain that system, the division of labour, it's going to take some energy from the people who have the reserves of energy.
And resources.
And the resources.
Right. Okay. We're going to have to leave it there, guys, for this segment because we're out of time, but I want to keep going. So why don't we stick around and do a bit of a podcasty thing, and we'll put it up on demand for our ADH listeners, and we'll put it out on the other channels as well. So we'll stick around and have a bit more of a conversation. I didn't quite expect we were going to go end up with a talk about gender and what's happening with gender in us, but it all fits together, doesn't it? The left, the right, the the male, the female feminism, feminism's connection with the left and the Greens and the environmental issues and blah, blah, blah. Okay, there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to unpack.
Well, maybe we should offer something approximating a solution.
Yes, well, just quickly, yeah, okay. So basically we need men to step up. We need capital to step up. We need people with money to start pulling their finger out and stop being so damn woke and starts defending traditional liberal free market values and capitalism and conservatism as it used to do.
Take responsibility.
Take responsibility, right. Okay,
I mean,
so sum it up.
The responsibility frame is perfect. My frame is entropy. Anything will entropy if you don't defend it, if you don't restore, if you don't put energy into it.
Okay. Well,
you want a free society. We're in the situation where the left want a very different type of society. So they are analogous to an invading army. And we're sat here wanting to defend our society, the West, individual sovereignty, property rights, and the productivity that comes from all that. And we're saying, we want to fight, but you guys have got all the money. Could you fund us some swords and shields?
We're going to continue the conversation now and talk a little bit more about the possible solutions for all of this. So I'm still joined by Scott Pelto and Rob McMullan. Scott, solutions you were mentioning.
So you know, the ultimately the solution is to take responsibility, but you know, we've got to put some meat around that so we understand what it means. The analogy I was given before about the family and the broader community, you know, families do tend to operate in maybe a socialist authoritarian manner because the children are too young. They're not at the age of responsibility. We raise them to become independent and move on. Now, when you move outside the family and into the community, you know, that's where we start to, we have reciprocal cooperation for exchanging products between people, which is the economy. And that economy is where we move maybe from that socialist family model, you know, into more of a capital model, because we know that capital works and we participate in this environment in a responsible way. It's the essence of competition. If people aren't responsible, they're not going to be a party, you know, to the model.
And that's how capitalism works.
Yeah, and this is why I talk about putting limits on government and the importance of voluntarism. So government is not a voluntary thing that anybody participates with. You know, we have to have it, but we have to understand that its role and its responsibility is limited. So I've heard you many times, you know, talk about the ABC and the government will fix it. Frankly, the government is not responsible for fixing it, Damian. We are.
Yeah, and we have to accept that.
We the people. Yeah. You know, and if we hold to the value of freedom...
But nobody wants to hear that. We all want to hear that the government's going to fix it. You know, mummy and daddy are going to step in and make everything better, and then I don't have to take personal responsibility. That's an incredibly appealing proposition to take to the electorate if you're a Green politician and you want to win votes.
But in doing so, we diminish our future, because that's what the responsibility is about. It's about, you know, ensuring and improving our future. So, you know, a quick example on numbers and where the government's responsibility lines are at the moment. We did the exercise on trying to work out, which is not easy, as you know, how much money governments in Australia spent in last year, 2023. The best source that I could find for that was the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Yep. Bring it all together and aggregate the number to, that's spending of all governments in the country, 916,550 million, so just short of $1 trillion.
That's a lot more than we take in tax. Government revenue is not that much. It's only about 600. Right?
Correct. So,
oops.
So, you know, we fund that with debt.
Yeah.
And you know, just to be clear on that debt, because it's another thing.
That's printing money.
Well, it's another thing that the left talk about all the time, like forgive the debt and debt redistribution. Governments take on debt by issuing treasury bonds, you know, to people like maybe someone in your family. They might say, you know, Mrs. McMullan, would you like to take a $10,000 treasury bond, as in you give me $10,000, the government, now I've got $10,000, and I'll give you all these sensationally favourable terms, you know, in terms of a yield on that bond and a guarantee of repayment, you know, when the bond matures. So
you get interest. You lend them 10 grand. You lend the government 10 grand. They give you a bit of paper. That's the bond.
Yep.
And that's a guarantee that they're going to give you that 10 grand back and the interest.
And I'm
for
now the
term of that
government
bond.
with this mounting debt, which is owed to, a person in Australia or a person in another country if they bought those bonds. So if we're to forgive this debt, if I'm not to
Who's
repay
doing the
it,
forgiving?
I'm not going to give your wife $10,000 back.
Yeah, it's not the government doing the forgiving; it's your wife.
Under under contracted terms.
Yeah.
It's immature and ideological and
Childish
extreme
again. Yeah.
to say that you can forgive debt.
Now let's just to elaborate on that for a little bit. Of course, if you don't pay it back this time, what happens next time, and what happens to your debt, what happens? Well, she's going to expect a much bigger interest rate if you go back a month later and say, "Hey, I need another $10,000."
Well, your credit worthiness decreases enormously.
So your AAA rating goes down to a double B minus.
In natural law terms, you decrease the incentive to cooperate.
Correct.
Yeah, right. Decreasing the incentive to cooperate.
So this is why I say that governments have a fiduciary relationship with the people that put them in those powers. When I talk about governments, I talk about politicians and the bureaucracy, because the politicians are supposed to represent us and control the bureaucracy. Otherwise, it will get out of control because they don't, freely participate in a competitive environment.
Yeah.
The money just comes to them because of the coercive, requirement for the people to give it.
Yeah, so that's stealing, or we would have called that stealing once. I don't think, obviously Jonathan Sriranganathan from the Greens and a lot of the Greens are very comfortable with the idea of stealing because they've actually promoted shoplifting from Coles and Woolies, as we said earlier in the show.
Well, that's disrespecting other people.
Yeah,
that's what it
is. It's disrespecting other people. It's not taking personal responsibility. So stealing's bad, we know that. And also not paying back your debts is bad, right?
Once again, you're just, as I said, actively reducing the incentive to cooperate. So and cooperation, as we've talked about very extensively, is productive, the most productive way. So you're decreasing the productivity of society. So what you're actually doing is you're just being, in the moment, a pack of locusts, consuming the systems that create the excess wealth to redistribute to you in the first place.
So this talking about where it goes, and this is really what concerns me, is we're diminishing the future for our descendants, for all of our children.
We're wrecking the system. It's the entropy factor.
We're consuming civilizational capital.
And so what happens, when we do that, I talk about this fiduciary responsibility that government has as they take, what they take in an involuntary manner. It means that they have an absolute obligation to spend the absolute minimum that can be spent, because people aren't volunteering, that effort, because money, captures effort that they made. People aren't volunteering this, they're taking it.
And we're constantly seeing governments say, look, we won't spend that much, we're going to hold back, we're going to be responsible. We never see that.
Well, back to those numbers, Damian. So the gross domestic product, if that is a reasonable measure, in Australia in 2023 was 1.68 trillion. So think about the spending versus, the product and who it is that's doing the spending in this case. Because, when you spend, it's also, like we've discussed previously, it's important to spend on operating expenses and also capital, which is a provision for the future. So if we've got a government spending more than half of all of the product, so that's not individuals investing, that's the government, as they decree, spending that money, then that puts our future in a poor position.
So we've got government spending $916 billion
almost a trillion
a year. We've got tax coming in from the productive value creating part of our society. That tax is taken from them. It's coming in at $600 billion a year.
Yeah.
And we have accumulated debt, so that gap is $300 billion roughly.
Yeah, continual
That's
borrowing.
accumulated to a debt now across all of our state and federal governments of about $1.4 6.8, did you say?
That's the GDP.
Oh, sorry, that's our gross
production.
domestic product, which is
Yeah.
a lot of thing. Okay, so sorry,
but the
and
debt-
the
the
debt's
debt's
about
a-
1.5 trillion, I think, across all state and federal.
Yeah,
now.
correct.
I really hope some of our previous listeners are listening to the extended version of the show, because there's something very important here which they need to understand. Is I know from first-hand experience that a lot of the people in the Labor Party are looking now, because as we talked about the asymmetry of wealth held by the 55s and up, they do have, compared to 55s and down, a lot of wealth there. And the political forces know this. And I know for a fact, one thing they're going to be looking at is inheritance taxes to make up that shortfall. So what I'd like to say to a lot of people who have financial agency, political agency, the system will entropy and you'll be paying one way or another. You can pay to train people into responsibility on your own terms, or you cannot pay that cost to defensively lead people out of self-defense, or you can, not pay that cost and they'll go to the Greens and Labor and you'll be paying it another way.
Well, but when we talk
With
about
your boomer head on a stake.
when we talk about
Bring out the boomers!
well, I'll show my
They're
age
going to go
now.
for it one way or
The
another.
mob are going to go here.
When we talk about big numbers, it just washes over people. They don't have a real connection with it. So I had an uncle that used to say, if you spoke about any big numbers, he'd say, well, that'd take a lot of chewing out and chewing gum, wouldn't it? So, that's...
See, they're the people we need. We don't
correct.
have these men anymore.
It's to
There's
get-
there's wisdom.
It's to get your head around,
right.
what makes up that big number.
Yeah.
Or he would say, well, it's not much if you say it fast, is it? So people bring.
Should we take the zeros off there?
Yeah, that's
Basically, we're spending $916 every year, and we're only earning $600 a year.
So
and our debt's currently $1,500.
Well, to make it real for people, Damian, I would say this. I looked up. Australia's got a population of 27 million people.
Yep.
I looked up how many of those were between 18 and 65, because in theory they're the ones that could contribute to government spending, whether they do or not. So you're slightly under 18 million people for 916 billion of expenditure. Per person per head, that comes down to about $51,000 for every person.
Per year.
So your contribution to all of the government activity was $51,000, even though you didn't give them $51,000 in tax, direct taxes, but they spent the money requiring a contribution
I'll
from
just
you.
say, I'm feeling that weight on my shoulders very presciently.
Same with you, Damian.
Not a small business, you're feeling it.
You're feeling
every
it.
day.
You're feeling it, yeah, that is true.
there you
It is
go.
true.
The point is this, and the point is, people individually, being able to own their destiny instead of the government spending their destiny. So individually, if we peeled that back, it's almost impossible to say, but if you took a stab at it and said, well, let's just spend money on what we must spend money, and everything that would be nice, we don't spend money on. Could we bring that $51,000 contribution from you back to, say, $25,000? I think that is entirely within the realms of possibility.
God, you could actually create a job for somebody and hire somebody.
That's the thing.
What that means, Rob, is if you're in a family of four, with 4 people over 18 and under $65,000, you've now brought back into your control $25,000 each. That's $100,000 that your little family unit every single year, and this is real. It sounds unreal, but it's real money, and it's a real scenario.
I like the way you said that, bring it back under your control, because that's essentially what it is, right? The economy, this is what I don't think people on the left understand. The economy has a fixed amount of value in it at any given point in time, right? It has the potential to be big.
Well, we can only produce so much.
Right, so there it is. There's the pie, okay? Now, either you're giving a proportion of that to the government. If you increase taxes, then all you're doing is shifting that piece of the pie, the control of that piece of the pie, from the business person, the productive person, to the government.
And
now,
wage earners.
who would you rather run stuff? The person who actually has had to learn to build a business and learn to take risk and learn from trial and error and have it, or some bureaucrat sitting in a government office.
Well,
I'd rather keep it with the person who knows how to create value.
Well, sure, but it also stays with a family of 4 people who are all wage earners, because it's when I said 51,000, that's per person, no matter if you're a business person or a wage earner. So you've got $100,000 now. Imagine that, it's real money. Under your control, if we could do this, if we could peel, government expenditure, down to just what is necessary, that's $100,000 this year, next year, the year after, where you can now start to say, well, what would I do with that? Would I spend some of it? Would I save some of it? Which is the purpose of money. If you did save it, you wouldn't want inflation diminishing.
No, so you'd have a vested interest in it.
The value of your pie. Yeah. So you save it, and then you do things with it. Maybe you open up opportunity for yourself and you chase your own destiny. Maybe you create something that you can transfer to your children. In the process of doing that, you teach them, they learn from it. It's a far more responsible, far better outcome than effectively outsourcing responsibility, which is what we do.
But the left would say you can't, people won't take responsibility, Scott. They'll spend that money on, trash television, trash movies and lolly. Well, hello. So this would bring me to you, Rob, I guess, and the idea of, that sense, that adulthood.
Look,
versus being a child, right? And taking that responsibility and
I think the long-term view is if people don't ever suffer consequences, they don't grow up. And
we've had a very luxury position.
We have had a luxury position, and what I really want to push forward as I think my central message to viewers is, if you have means, whether it's intellectual, financial, even time, whatever way you can, we need people to be taking responsibility for younger people and showing them better ways, and trying to mentor and incentivize them into small business. I'm very passionate about small business because I know that from my personal story, when you work in a small business, you have lunch with the boss. He'll have a coffee and he'll tell you how it runs, and you have the ability to learn in a way that you don't working, in a large corporate. You're not face to face often with the guy who calls the shots, who's got access to the bank accounts, who runs the actual business. And so for my personal story is, for me, it was a way to learn undo the misinformation I learned at university and in school, and to work my way out of a fairly disadvantaged financially background and become a responsible person. And the middle class is often more moral because they're the ones face to face all the time with reciprocal cooperation. You have a degree of parasitic elites and you have a degree of a parasitic dependent class. But the middle class is where people are more responsible and closest face to face with reciprocity.
Well, I've been saying for a while now that I really don't like the terms left and right. I don't like dividing people. It's not conducive to reciprocal cooperation when you divide people. And I have this. I
apologise, but there's no. I mean, it's the,
no,
it's the easy shortcut way of saying, those who seek large government is the left. Those who seek small government.
Well, I have this core belief that that fundamentally, the majority of people all want the same thing. We all share a similar destiny. Now we certainly vary on the fringes, and all people have competing interests, but we're also all people, and we all fundamentally need the same thing. And so my pitch, in talking about an alternative, better future, like the future for us, for people on Earth, could be stunning, could be absolutely stunning. The way we've progressed, the abilities, that people have. There's almost anything imaginable we could take, provided that we understand that we have to make sacrifices, that we have to suffer through the journey to get there. But in doing so, there's meaning. There's meaning in that journey.
And learning.
And if instead of outsourcing that destiny, which again we capture the value of that in money, and if we kept that with individuals, so it's not about the money, it's about keeping that value that you can do something with in the future instead of outsourcing it. And if we did that and brought it in, who knows what we could achieve?
Exactly.
Who knows?
The problem is that we're killing small business at the moment. We're squeezing small business in between big government and big corporations. And big government and big corporations are, in fact, colluding, I think. And this is where the problem is with big capital, because the left like gigantism, right? And they want that centralised control and that centralised power. What's happened in Australia that hasn't happened in other countries is that we have compulsory superannuation. And that is feeding this massive superannuation industry. And then you have industry super funds, which are tied to unions, and they are making the demands on all these social things like ESG and DEI, and they're basically redirecting capital into leftist politics, leftist political causes, which is inefficient, but also means that we're shifting again to the left, the culture. And so, you know, the traditional sort of capital resources for the right, for conservatism, for individual promotion of individual values, traditional conservative or right-wing or centre-right values, classical liberal values of small business, that's all disappearing. That money's not there anymore.
Well, there's
because government's colluding with, now small business, how do they collude? How do they squeeze small business? Regulation, right? You put regulation on a small bit, you say, oh, you've got to have this safety regulation, or you've got to have this new definition of what a part-time worker is versus a casual worker, because it all makes perfect sense. Oh, wonderful if you, in theory, and wonderful if you're a big corporation with a great big budget and you've got a big legal department. But if you're a small business person, that takes another 2 hours of your day or your week away, and you get less time with your family, and you get run into the ground, and you don't want to run a small business anymore, and you want to retire on the beach like so many men over 50 are doing, in particular men, I'm sorry, women too, but definitely. And so we're losing those father figures, those mentors, those people that would traditionally be there, because they're not getting supported by anybody. So I think we're really in trouble because the big capital, big corporations, and big government are working together to get that power and lord it over everybody else. And I just don't see how we get out of this mess. I'm a bit depressed.
I would say these are moves in fundamental economic models. One is a socialist model, one is a capitalist model, and everything. I don't think we have to make a case. I think it's self-evident that the shift, the direction that the Western world is heading into, is away from capitalism and towards socialism. We do not have a pure capital model, not now.
No, but how do you avoid the Peter Hitchens mentality, which is, I give up, it's all a disaster, we're all going to fall to pieces?
What you have to do...
Take responsibility.
Yep, and another aspect of that is men need to insure each other. See, men also have a very toxic behaviour of throwing other men under the bus for their own status. And you find that a lot too. A lot of men are like, well, if I can promote DEI and it screws over a lot of other people in small business, but I get to funnel that profit to me, I'm doing just great. I'm doing just great. But rights and defense of rights and defense of the civilization that we want is only possible with mutual insurance. And this is part of the West too, in terms of mutual defense of sovereign interests, and it develops back from, right back in Europe, where it's like we're all these tribes and towns, but we have agreements to mutually defend each other. Someone gets attacked, we all go there, but we're still sovereign. We have our sovereign interests. We're sovereign over our own little towns and things. We've got
NATO.
Well,
we've got an agreement. Anyway.
It's just an idea that we have to mutually, reciprocally defend each other's sovereign interests.
Which I would say, I think voluntary, of all people, is key to anything we move to. If we can't do it in a voluntary way, we can't do it. You cannot get buy-in from people, and you cannot, march in a solid direction unless those people are voluntarily doing it, which is the essence of reciprocal cooperation.
That's right.
So however the solution is presented, it's got to be. People have to be convinced that it's in their best interest.
Personally, I'm speaking to a very small percentage of the population because a few small people well organised can create a big splash.
Yep.
There are a few great organisations out there. Obviously, the Libertarians are doing a really good job. They're great people. There's another organisation I've been following, the British Australian community. There's a few organisations out there that are ready and willing to do good work. and a few people getting behind them and supporting them goes a long way. But, you know, it doesn't seem like there's anyone with a huge burning incentive to defend our civilization. Like I said, a lot of the elites are happy to profit on the way down. They're happy to profit on its transition into socialist structure.
Probably because they're okay and they haven't passed on the knowledge.
We haven't even touched on climate change, but yeah, I mean, climate change is a whole other area that really plays on that, right?
If nobody defends a thing, it will not persist. Yeah. That's the truth. And so what I'm saying out there is, if you're listening to this, you know, invest in your civilization if you wanted to continue.
Well, there's the old saying that the way that evil prospers and goes forward is for good people to stand by and let it happen.
Absolutely.
That's how it happens. You know, and this I think it's important to understand, you know, the history of socialism and where it came from and where it can go to. So, which starts with Karl Marx, a German economic philosopher from 1890. So you've got to, go back to...
He didn't bathe, apparently. Bit of a stinker.
You've got to go back to that time period. And he wrote two books. He wrote The Communist Manifesto and Das Capitalism, in the way to tear down capitalism. That Communist Manifesto provides a roadmap of what is required to tear down the capital system. And you can pretty much see it playing out right now, that roadmap.
Well, and that was taken by the the German group that I was talking about earlier, who.
Well, I think people need to understand this as well.
University.
So, to me, the culmination of everything that ever went wrong in the world, the absolute breakdown of reciprocal cooperation, was World War II. That was the breakdown of it.
Yeah.
And then understand that the three people, who at least headed the groups, you've got Hitler, you've got Mussolini,
Stalin,
and Hirohito. Stalin and Lenin, were also terrible socialists who killed tens of millions of their own people, but it was those three groups, that wanted to progress against everybody else. And then understand the background of those people. So, Hitler, started as a socialist politician. The Nazi party is the National Socialist Workers' Union in Germany. Mussolini started as a socialist politician, and Mussolini created fascism. And fascism, as I understand the root of the words, is to bind together, and in binding together, it's what you were talking about before, where you bind large corporations and government and the media, as the third source, to bind them together to, it's under the guise of nationalism for those individuals at the expense of others to move forward.
Which is why we're actually seeing the fascism come out of the left.
Hirohito, the same thing. So you've got to understand where this shift to authoritarianism, which happens because we devolve responsibility and say, you take it, instead of us taking it.
Could I make a point on that? I would actually debate that Karl Marx was an economist. I think he's better.
That's actually
framed.
true.
Well, I think it's better framed as communism is actually more framed as a religion and a cult religion. The central idea of Marxism is and all forms of Marxism as it's evolved through the ages, is a false promise of freedom from the laws of nature.
It's a lie.
It's a lie, but specifically it's a false promise of freedom from the laws of nature. In that Marxism was a false promise that we can be free of scarcity. And we can't, because it's a law of nature.
Yeah, I see.
And as it's evolved, the race Marxists have very openly taken to whatever they want to define as attacking white people, and they're selling their followers, their cult followers, a freedom, a utopia after whiteness. The feminists, the hardcore ones, will sell their followers a false promise of utopia after men.
That's what
and the neo-Nazis are utopia after Jews, and then you've got
that's right.
But yeah,
so
it just goes on and on.
But it's the same formula repackaged in a lot of ways.
Utopia after carbon.
Well, if
But we get rid of after net zero.
But Marx promised freedom from scarcity, but it's not possible. So that's why it doesn't work.
I would say to the listeners, we're talking about a solution. I would say this: read history, understand economics. I agree with you. Marx wasn't an economist, but he was a philosophical, economist. He then gave rise to Keynesianism. And the central tenet of Keynesianism.
Yeah, let's not talk about Keynesian.
It's
it's run economics for like the last
isn't that a false promise? It's that money needs to be tied to real value.
Well, it's the idea that you can do, you can stimulate the economy by just printing more money, and that's the whole problem, and why we've got modern monetary theory.
Think about what we're against in this education thing. So, the universities are owned and controlled by governments and bureaucrats. Keynesian economics is what is taught at university.
But this is I think we've defined the problem, guys. We know why Australia's in trouble, why Australia's in crisis. The solution, I guess, is men have got to step up.
Correct.
Women have got to step up. We've got to be more mentoring. We've got to be more. Capital has got to step up in a big way and stop supporting the left and woke ideas.
I'll put something else out there, and this is going to be controversial. Two things. Do you want me to be controversial?
It's going to be more controversial. It's going to be more controversial. Hey, wait on for a minute. Here we go.
Back on to...
If you do a gender thing on me, we're going to be...
No, I'm not going to do a gender thing. Because let's cut to Max Chandler Mather, our Greens MP and the seat of Griffith.
We have to wrap up, so make it quick.
Okay, so we're talking about false...
We're talking Brisbane here. Max Chandler Mather is an inner city Brisbane federal member of parliament that was elected. We didn't have Teals in Brisbane, so we got a lot of Greens in the inner city instead of Teals. Go ahead.
So we're talking about false promise.
Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, Rob was the candidate for the UAP in that particular electorate that was beaten by Max Chandler Mather.
Right. So I ran against two very well-trained Marxists, Max Chandler Mather and the incumbent was Terry Butler. And what you find, Labor Party, Greens and Labor Party. So I saw a clip recently of Max saying property handouts, I think what's the phrase he's using, or investor handouts. He keeps using his word handout. And I came to understand that what he's talking about is, there's a basic reciprocity that if the government wants to take a part of your profits when a business makes money, it's just reciprocity that you'll get a tax deduction if you lose money. But claiming a tax deduction, Max is reframing, lying, calling that a handout. But it's just a lie.
The power of language and words.
That's right.
Yeah,
and so
Goebbels was very good at language.
Goebbels was the guy on language and words, and they do it so well.
But the problem is it works for their base. It works really well, and for younger people who aren't told otherwise, it would be very easy for me to get up there and say, money represents value. If I do work, the work is the value, the good or service.
Yeah.
So
money's just a representation of that.
That's right. So if the money gets taken from that good or service and given to someone else who didn't do that work, that is the definition of a handout. But if I do work and lose value because my business has legitimate tax deductions, that is literally not a handout, it's a tax deduction. But he wants to equate, because being left-wing, he wants to justify handouts to his base, the consumption to his base, by equating, saying, we can take from all these corporates because they have illegitimate profits because they rely on handouts anyway. So basically, he's just lying.
They're all going to pack up and go home. That's what they're going to do.
Well, the point is, though, he's lying.
Yeah.
Very brazenly.
Yeah.
And another clip that's very famous from Terry Butler talking to Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson saying, well, in a democracy, women do have political agency. And she said, well, no, they don't because they're not represented in Parliament. He said, how can they not be represented in Parliament? They vote for representatives like everyone else. And she did a category lie by saying that the assumption she didn't say but implied was that a woman can only be adequately represented in Parliament by another woman. Which if she voiced that axiom, that implication, you'd pick it apart as absurd. Because men and women can vote for whoever they want. But she lied, and Jordan Peterson responded to that by saying, I don't understand your question. Of course he doesn't, because she's just lying. She's lying to bait him into a situation of looking silly to her base. I mean, to someone who knows, she looks silly because she's just lying.
Yeah.
But what do you think about this? In matters of the public, from a public position, when talking to the public, politicians should not be able to lie, like legally, not be able to brazenly lie?
Well, I think you'd be imposing government force over people, and then you have the horrible situation that we have with the problem with the freedom of speech, which is that you can't, you have to have someone arbitering, you have to have someone deciding what a lie is and what a lie isn't. And I just think in our current situation...
Do you think that there's a lot that you could easily
Yes, I think there's objective truth. I don't believe in relativism,
yeah,
of course. So I do think there are things that you can point out and go, that's a blatant lie.
I mean, do people, is it reciprocity for people to be lied to by politicians?
Well, it's not fully exhaustively informed.
That's right. So you can speak in testimonialism, I believe, and my best understanding is this. But when Max Chandler says they're getting a handout, it's just a brazen lie.
Yeah, it's PR spin though, and I think people would say,
it's not a spin, it's a
yeah,
lie.
okay, I agree with you. No, I agree with you, but I'm just
concept.
saying, you know,
Yeah.
it's the use of language, the manipulation of language, which is something that the left has done very well. What concerns me is when they shift debates completely, and you find yourself debating. So they do the trick of like, you know, I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but well, I guess, you know, debating whether or not we should say the welcome to country instead of debating the very fundamental essence of the idea of Indigenous people, right? So we've shifted the debate. So we now will accept this. And you get your opponents to accept things by moving the debate to the next level and getting them to argue about that. And the underlying assumption is the previous thing, you know what I mean? So you're taking it to... And that's a real sneaky thing the left does all the time.
Well, they abuse language.
Yeah.
And they conflate.
Yep.
And this is the no-win situation.
I mean, the right do too, but not to the extent, not as well and not as sophisticated a way as the left are doing at the moment.
No.
But anyway.
The left, you know, once again, it's part of that empathy brain, system brain. They live in the world of language and perception, and they're masters of it.
I see. So it's more.
You know, they can craft public perception like we can build an aeroplane.
Yeah.
They're different.
Guys, it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm sorry we can't go on forever, but we can't. So we've got to wrap it up. It's been more than an hour, but it's flown by. Thank you so much, Scott Pelto, for joining us on the other side. And thank you, Rob McMullan, for coming in.
Pleasure.
Guys, I hope we see a lot more of you in the future on the show.
Absolutely.
Great to have these discussions, and we'll get you back to talk about other things in the near future, I hope.
All right. Thanks, Damian.
All right. Great. Good to have you with us, everybody. Thanks for staying for the extended version of this particular episode of The Other Side, our special off-the-set edition as we deep dive on the question of, is Australia in crisis? I don't know if we got too many answers. I think the answer is yes. The question is, how do we get out of it? I think we've got some good ideas out there anyway. So we'll catch you for our regular The Other Side, dropping every Friday, of course, our weekend show. And it's available on ADH.TV as well as many other platforms, but primarily ADH TV first and best place to watch the show. So do join us there, and all of the other great content on ADH TV is at your fingertips as well. ADH.TV on any browser, and you can download the app as well. We'll catch you really soon. Take care. Bye for now.